And good morning. Happy Halloween, everybody. I hope everybody's got some great costumes and plan to have a good time with the family. And you'll be out there today taking your kids trick or treating. Sure would be nice if Halloween had fallen on a Friday and we could do a Halloween themed Firearms Friday for that one. But here's the advice: check the candy, sure, but don't go trick-or-treating without a gun. Wear your daily carry. Be prepared. It's dark out there, and it's crazy. Personally, I'm not a big fan of trick-or-treating in the modern era because, quite frankly, like, I live in a golf course community, and I don't understand why people think this is okay. The streets are going to be a clotted nightmare tonight, because lazy assholes are going to load their kids up in SUVs and drive from house to house to house to house. It's psychotic. So, my kids want to go trick-or-treating. We go early while the sun's still just barely up before the assholes come around jumping out of their pickup trucks and SUVs like they're trying to go and loot the local Target or Saks Fifth Avenue and get back in the house and wait for it to be over, because Jesus, I mean, it's crazy and dangerous. So, speaking of crazy and dangerous, AI has been a big topic lately. You know this, I know this, and we've talked about AI a few times. Cameron and I have even had some pretty entertaining conversations speculating on the eventual inevitable development of the Skynet protocol. AI is scary. And like I've covered before, we talked about the Panopticon, 1984, Big Brother in the surveillance state. And of course, the scary notion of science fiction predictors like The Matrix and 1984 and The Terminator, etc. They all rest on the premise, the idea that, now The Terminator to a somewhat lesser degree, and I'm going to get into that a bit, but they generally rest on the premise that technology is a double-edged sword, and the grim future looks like oppressive governments will use technology to more and more aggressively stamp the boot down on your neck against your will. It will be forced upon you. But like I've covered, talking about, everybody's got an iPhone or an Android, some kind of smartphone that they use, right? 1984, that nightmare-scape of controlled media, constant surveillance, and the memory hole, the ability to curate and edit history. We bought it. We bought it voluntarily. We chose it. And that is the world we live in today. Now, The Terminator tells a somewhat different story, because in The Terminator, Skynet, while it does eventually become a government defense program and the military gets involved, Skynet describes a private entity, even though it's funded by government. It describes a private entity creating a product that's originally intended to benefit humanity as a technological advance, and then government involvement. It gets involved in the defense systems and becomes that nightmare. Well, I don't think it necessarily, and I think I've already proved that with just the simple arguments I've made about the difference between the 1984 predictor of overbearing government versus the real world outcome of voluntary adoption. I don't think it necessarily requires that the government get involved for AI to become something like Skynet. But fear not, because the government is getting right dicks deep into it. The White House announces executive order on AI. It provides guidelines for AI privacy and safety. Right off the rip, before we even read the executive order, which I do have pulled up. I take it back. I have the fact sheet pulled up, but it's the White. So I've got this article from Tech Republic, and then I've got the AI fact sheet, the White House's fact sheet on the AIEO. Say that 5 times fast. Right before we even get into that, take you back to the stolen election of 2020, right? Take you back to the gross and overbearing and absolutely inignorable censorship of conservative voices in social media and public platforms since the part of what was important and terminate. Okay, hold on a second. Cameron's got a good point. Part of what was important in Terminator was wiring defense into AI. It was a trade-off for safety versus security. Yes. Yes. Damn it, I wish you were... I got to get you back in studio again soon, brother. I'd like to talk down that rabbit hole instead of just replying to a comment. You're right, but I'm gonna come. Let me get back on track here. The point I was making is, you look back at the stolen 2020 election. You look back at all of the conversation after the 2016 election, because let's not forget, since 2020. Those of us who believe that the 2020 election was obviously stolen, and we believe that because this is a tough one, but stick with me. Pay close attention. This is going to blow your mind, right? We believe that because the 2020 election was obviously stolen. No intelligent person can look at the 2020 election and say that was exactly like every other election. That looked like a normal election, right? So even if you don't buy that 2020 was completely and utterly stolen, you cannot intelligently say that it doesn't look suspiciously different than every other election we've ever had. But we haven't been allowed to say that until very recently. This show has been deplatformed from YouTube temporarily, but repeatedly since the 2020 election was obviously stolen, and we've said as much clearly on the show on multiple occasions. We've been thrown out over and over again. Now, they stopped doing that finally. I can't imagine why. But then you look back at the period from 2016 to 2020, that entire time that Donald Trump was in office, the Democrats repeated over and over again, all over social media, without consequence, what we now not only know to have been the false claim that Russia stole the election, but the claim that was intentionally, deliberately funded and propagated by Hillary Clinton, the Hillary Clinton campaign, and the Democrat National Committee, with the obvious and proved complicity and compliance of the entire media establishment. That's not an opinion. That's not a far-stretching tinfoil hat theory. That is court case document proved fact. That's not a position on which there is any contention. That Hillary Clinton's campaign funded the Russia hoax and spent the entire Trump administration engaged in election denial is brute fact. A big part of what allowed all of that to happen is a little something called Section 230. It's the bill governing the responsibilities and liabilities of tech platforms and publishers. It argues, and it's a reasonable argument. This is one of the things that's so frightening and insidious about it. This is a very good and reasonable argument. It argues that a publisher, that you have a thing called a publisher and a thing called a platform, right? A publisher is an entity which publishes information and maintains editorial control over what the publication includes. The obvious example being newspapers and magazines, television programs, right? Whereas a platform is more like Ma Bell, it's AT&T, it's the communication service provider. And the idea is that if the newspaper, if the publisher allows the publication to publish illegal speech, then the publication is responsible for that speech, is liable for that speech. Whereas if a platform does it, then the platform cannot be held liable. And here's where that all sounds good in theory, because it's not reasonable. This is the base, like, this is the you can't yell fire in a crowded theater argument against free speech, sort of. And I use that example advisedly because, of course, anybody who knows anything about the law knows that the fire in a crowded theater comes from an old Supreme Court case, was not actually the subject of the case, was a quote from one of the justices who was making a point about restricted free speech, and has been explicitly excoriated by later findings, where not only was the case itself overthrown, strengthening free speech under the law and its interpretation with precedents, but the justice who made the statement has been excoriated repeatedly by other judges, pointing out that essentially for him to even say that phrase, to make that claim, is insane within the context of the law, as you know, for comparison's sake. But the argument being made with the difference between platform and publisher seems to make sense, because it doesn't make sense that, let's say, Mohammed bin Salman is planning a terrorist attack with, Joe Biden, for example, on the phone, right? Where they're clearly engaged in conspiracy to commit a crime. That's not a good reason for me to be unable to order a pizza over the phone. That's not a good reason for you to be unable to call your mother and say happy birthday, like this upcoming Saturday, when I'm not going to bother to call my mom because I'll be there at the farm and I love you, Mom. It's not reason enough that someone is using the platform to commit crime is not a good reason to take the platform away from everybody else. Well, this is the backdrop, the excuse that has been used since really the early Obama administration to protect groups like, or entities like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc., when they use their platforms for censorship. Now, the way 230 reads, as soon as YouTube censors me for my free speech, they have taken editorial control of their platform. Now, that's fine. I'm okay with that. You want to censor me on your platform? It's your platform, if it's a private platform. If you're not being instructed by the government to do so, sure, that's fine. Because private platform, right? Do what you do. But as soon as you take editorial control and censor my speech, then you should be held liable for all criminal speech that happens on your platform, because you have just changed from being a platform to being a publisher. That editorial control is a major difference. I've probably spent too much time on Section 230, but it's important to understand that contextual difference, because Section 230 has been used as the shield to allow corrupted entities like YouTube, Facebook, etc. They've used that as the shield and the excuse to let government agents backdoor their way into using the platforms to engage in the criminal activity of suppressing free speech by government mandate. Now, since the government is using the platforms to do it, there's a crime happening there. The government agency is committing the crime. There's an argument to be made that the individual platforms were being coerced by government and should have some recourse to petition the government for redress of their grievances. But since even though they were coerced, it has to at least be entertained that they then committed themselves to editorial control, and are now, if they censor any speech, then they must censor all speech that is abhorrent. So that means that Twitter should be held responsible for the pornography that they produce, as should YouTube. Make no mistake, you can go on YouTube right now and you will find the gay boy game where they play, is it a cock or a carrot, right? One guy lays down on the floor and they put a sheet over to cover him, and then they play a game where they stick things in his butt and ask him what he thinks they are. That's on YouTube. That's available. Just so we're clear. Because having taken editorial control, they are liable for that content. They are responsible for that content and should be treated as such. So the one more thing I want to say, and I know we're 20 minutes into the show and I haven't even really gotten into the executive order yet, because there is so much important context that leads up to everything that needs to be said about this executive order. And that's the other piece of context that's important. This is an executive order. As in, the president signed in by fiat that this is how policy is to be determined. But it reads like law. Executive order is not law. The president does not have the authority through executive order to affect the activity of citizens. The idea that our government in any capacity has the authority at all to engage in prescriptive law, which is, as opposed to prohibitive law, which is to say that the government thinks that it has the authority to tell you how to behave, right? It's one thing for us all to agree on ways that we wish one another not to behave. Do not murder, do not steal, do not rape, do not mutilate children, do not kidnap children and sell them to sex slavers, right? These are prohibitive laws. But this executive order goes so far as to presume the authority to prescribe affirmative activities to named individuals. Well, at least to named entities. So, the Biden administration directed government organizations, including NIST, to encourage responsible and innovative use of AI. So, the way they get around what I've just described, the prescriptive legislation of activity to private individuals, is the White House has said government agencies will encourage private entities to take specific affirmative actions, right? So, what does the executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy AI cover? Safety and security. Any company developing any foundation model that possesses a serious risk to national security, national economic security, or national public health and safety must keep the U.S. government informed of their training and red team safety tests. Now that right there That does not read like an executive order. That reads like a prescriptive law. Oh, you're a private company that wants to engage in research and development into technology and science? You are hereby ordered by the president to divulge all of your company secrets by grand fiat of executive order, by dint of dynastic command. You will surrender your information. Privacy. The development and use of privacy-preserving techniques will be prioritized in terms of federal support. Privacy guidance for federal agencies will be strengthened with AI risks in mind. Did we all forget about the superheroes over at Apple who refused to comply until a judge's order forced it to happen? The government to say that it has an interest in your privacy is a lie. The government is actively interested in the abolition of your Fourth Amendment rights. It's a constant struggle. From every cop looking for an ID cookie, all the way up to the NSA reading your email. The government is not only uninterested in your privacy, they are categorically opposed to it. Equity and civil rights. Okay. This word right here, as soon as you see the word equity in anything coming out of the government, you know it's corrupted. The word equity, anytime it appears in government policy, practice, or procedure, is instantaneously and inherently racist. The objective of the equity, the use of the language of equity in all of law today is to replace white men with incompetent other than white men. The incompetent is an important part of that. Right? It's not just, well, we want slow down before I stumble over it. It is important for the programs of equity, in order for them to succeed at their objectives, that they not only replace all straight white men everywhere they can with people who are categorically other than a straight white man. But much, a great example of this principle you can see in the White House press secretary. I forget her name, but you know the diversity hire I'm talking about. I'm the first lesbian woman of color, and she's awful. And I don't mean like, I just hate the way that she handles press conferences because she's such a typical Democrat. She's outrageously incompetent. Like we joked for days about Peppermint Saki and the whole circle back thing. Let me circle back to that. 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 She's like a walking fucking cyclical redundancy error. Right? I mean, she KJP should have a freaking or I'm sorry, not KJP, but Peppermint Saki. She should have a giant, ugly scar down one side of her face because she sounds like a fucking scratched record. Let's circle back to that. Let me circle back to that. Let me circle back to that. Let me circle back to that. I mean, cyclic redundancy error. It's important that they replace straight white men with other than who are incompetent. Remember the nuclear biological material waste secretary who was arrested? He was arrested. I think he was arrested 3 times for stealing luggage at airports, and we found out that not only was he stealing luggage at airports, but like he was doing his research who was flying when and where, and specifically stealing high-end designer clothing from targeted wealthy people. Like, that's who the replacement mechanism is for. That's what equity is always about. That's what they mean when they use that word. And then, I mean, just go promoting workers. Okay, so union stuff. Let's have a bunch of rich Hollywood actors go and strike and demand more money. It's like how many stories have we read where the female lead in a film with a male lead, so the female co-star who gets second billing because it's the man's story, is complaining that the man got paid more money. And it's like Robert Downey Jr. and somebody that wouldn't have a career except that she was in this movie with Robert Downey Jr. And she's complaining that she didn't get paid as much as he did. Well, no, you didn't, because people didn't go see that movie for you. Now, they might have seen your sexy little ass in that movie with him because they went to see the movie with him, and they liked you, and for that reason, they're going to go watch the next movie you make. But honey, he made the money on that one. That's how that worked. And we saw Black Widow, sweetheart. It wasn't that good. Could have been. Could have been. But you wouldn't let it be. So, I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in it. Got stuff to do. The big takeaway here is that Joe Biden just took out his executive order pen and said, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Nothing government does is not done well. It is done. Hang on. Nothing that the government does is done poorly by mistake. The bad outcome was, in fact, the objective. That is always and everywhere true. Your health insurance went through the roof because that was the point to Obamacare. There is a new war sparking off in the Middle East where the Taliban has just been carefully and expensively and blatantly armed by American incompetence. The objective was to restore war to the Middle East. One of Biden's many objectives going into office was to undo Trump's peace talks. The Russia-Ukraine conflict. Joe Biden directly incited that with his policies. It all looks like, on paper, it was unintentional. But the disastrous outcome was the obvious disastrous outcome. Right? Every government maneuver that ends in disaster is a hillbilly with a can of Tannerite and an M4 saying, hey, I wonder what'll happen. No, you don't. You said that for the camera and comedic effect. We all know it. We enjoy the explosion. It's fun to watch the Tannerite blow up when you put a round in it. But we're not surprised that that's what happens. We knew that the explosive outcome was the obvious outcome. So, I'll put a pin in it there for today. Love you guys. Happy Halloween. Y'all be safe out there. Stay calm and carry one. Love you, and we'll see you tomorrow.